So Roger, thank you for being here and for talking with us today about counterfeiting and piracy. As folks may know, Roger's a publishing industry veteran. He has 20 plus years of experience in
Yeah.
our favorite topic, which is supply chain management. He's been working in trade and higher education, so he knows both sides of that equation, and piracy and counterfeiting feel a little bit different in each, but they're also good overlaps. He's good at finding skills between vendors in negotiation and selection. He does a lot of work in IP protection, as well as sustainable sourcing strategies. We're lucky to have him here. Roger, your affiliation right now is with Macmillan, and we're glad to hear your perspective. If you want to aim for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, and if you go longer, that's fine. But if just to give us your perspective on current issues and trends and when it comes to counterfeiting and piracy, and I think people will have lots of comments and questions to follow.
Great. Thanks. End of the day, counterfeiting and piracy is obviously a major concern for most publishers. One way or the other, our intellectual property, collectively as a publishing industry, is the biggest asset that we have. It's where all of our revenue derives from, essentially. And there's multiple touch points in which that IP could theoretically become at risk. There's internal touch points in terms of how well you're securing the files in which you have ownership of, whether they be final files or with work in process files. The sharing of those files can theoretically start to undercut potential future revenue if that sharing occurs in a non-secure space. And who has access to those files via some kind of firewall is important in terms of ensuring that you don't end up having a marketing person or editorial assistant sending out a set of final files to a potentially sending it out unsecurely to a potentially fraudulent person. So there's internal practices that you need to ensure are in play and established, monitored, updated as technologies evolve, so that everybody involved within the publishing process is aware of and compliant with those kinds of practices. Each publishing company is going to have their own sets of determinations regarding how best to internally secure their files. But some kind of framework and mapping is required, in my opinion, to ensure that compliance across all individuals within the house ends up becoming the play. On top of that, most publishers have some kind of outsource of pre-press and print vendors. So any kind of negotiations that you're having with any outside vendors should include their own security protocols that should be reviewed, monitored, and updated on a regular basis to ensure that they too are in compliance with your own in-house protocols, as well as ensuring that any kind of data leaks or hacks or anything along those lines, there's a roadmap as to when notification needs to happen to the publisher from the vendor, and mapping out exactly what happened, what was exposed, and potentially any kind of remediations that could be possible. After that, you start to bridge out into sort of two different avenues when you deal with physical piracy versus or digital piracy versus physical counterfeiting. And when you're dealing with physical counterfeits, where somebody is, printing a book that is based off of your files and your assets, one of the biggest tells that a counterfeit book is out there in the marketplace, partly is going to be based off of price. Typically, they will try to undercut the price of the product. So, and I'm just making something up. Let's say your book normally sells for $50. They might use some kind of third-party online marketplace to be able to sell it for $25. And those kinds of, we'll say, less than believable sale prices could attract potential end users and customers simply because the price is 50% off. But one of the ways that you have the ability as a publisher to identify those is not just based off of the price, but also based off of, doing some test purchases for that seller and checking the materiality of the product. So knowing what materials you use, the paper, the cover finishes, the cover colors, the boards, the kinds of headbands that you use in a hardcover book, those kinds of materialities become very integral in terms of being able to identify a legitimate copy versus counterfeit copy. And making those kinds of comparisons is clutch in terms of being able to identify the counterfeit product and tracing it back to the seller, who may or may not necessarily be aware that they are selling a counterfeit product. Depends on the seller, depends on the conversations that you end up having with them. Many sellers buy books in bulk. They could be buying it from non-legitimate sources, or they could be buying them like off of some kind of remainder or used books, and therefore they have the ability to be able to, we'll say, dirty their own inventory with counterfeit copies that aren't necessarily known to them off the top. On top of that, that materiality becomes clutch to dealing with the physical counterfeits, but there's also obviously digital piracy that happens on an everyday basis. There are plenty of various websites and tools for pirates to distribute their illegitimate digital copies of their of archives, and therefore utilizing tools like web scraping, potentially outside vendors that specialize in these kinds of tasks and products, to be able to identify and hopefully take down any kinds of digital piracy that's out there in the marketplace. After that, theoretically, if it justifies the costs and justifies the infringement extent, I'll say, litigation is always an option available to any publisher if needed. Obviously, talk with your own legal counsel about it. But those are sort of the touch points and avenues in which counterfeits theoretically end up making out into a marketplace, whether through physical counterfeiting or digital piracy. And in general, it can undercut the financial results of any publishing company. That varies, based on the publisher, really more so than anything else. But I've seen it be, as high as a handful of percent of revenue, and that by itself can start to, depending on the publisher, can start to add up to large dollar amounts, one way or the other. That's all I got. But let's go to questions, I guess.
Yeah, you bet. I've been typing a few of them into chat, but let me just ask a few of them.
Sure.
So it has been said that the copy, or that the quality of some of the copies coming out of China are higher quality than the domestically printed editions. Have you seen that to be the case?
Well, quality is always subjective. So So the question becomes is, quality and what level? Are we talking about the paper's a little thicker, and less, has a lower opacity rating, potentially. I've seen copies out of China and India, that have come back that are at least at par. They are not necessarily undercutting from a physical quality perspective. But I've also seen ones that use, the zippers on your pants as a headband. So, it's not like a real headband. It's like literally a zipper. Or the boards in a hardcover book are utilizing subpar board quality, or the adhesive isn't necessarily great. But I have seen, especially in paperbacks, simply because there's less materiality within a paperback, high quality products that could look like legitimate copies, if not compared to an actual legitimate exemplar copy of a product. And that's where, knowing that's why the supply chain itself and the production and manufacturing teams should be involved in any kind of identification process, simply because they'll be the closest people to know what they did use, what they produced, what kind of materials they sourced for the product, and that can vary based off of printings. So you could have a third printing of a book that's offset produced somewhere in the United States. Fourth printing of the book is digitally produced via an inkjet process. Looking through a scope on either of those products in terms of how the ink falls is going to change. The paper is going to change. So knowing those nuanced differences between print runs also becomes critical in terms of being able to identify legitimate versus counterfeit copies. Typically, as I've seen in the past, most counterfeit copies are based off of the first printing or second printing of the book. And that's also why having standardizations regarding how you identify print runs within your book is critical, so that this way you can literally just, most people do it on the copyright page, go to the copyright page, see that this is printing number 3, and it says it's manufactured in the United States, and you have the ability to be able to identify exactly where that printing happened within your systems, depending on your system records, being able to see that printing number 3 happened at XYZ printer on ABC date, and used this kind of paper, this kind of manufacturing process, this kind of board spec, this kind of cover finish, and therefore be able to hold that exemplar up with all of those specifications against the potential counterfeit copy, and look at the counterfeit copy and see that the paper might be the same, or close enough that it's hard to tell, but you might identify that the boards are not necessarily up to snuff, or that the cover finish is now a full gloss lamination instead of a matte lamination, let's say. Those kinds of instances, and the familiarity with your product as a publisher becomes critical in terms of being able to identify counterfeit and legitimate copies within somebody's inventory if you're doing some kind of inspection or something along those lines.
There was a question about proof tags, and the author of the question asked or mentioned that they knew that scholarly presses are using them, and just for everybody here, could you talk about what proof tags are, and are they useful in trade publishing?
Sure. So proof tags and other kind of QR code based identifiers of any product, typically the way it works is that every copy will be serialized. So every copy of a legitimate run of your product, let's say you're running 10,000 copies of a biochemistry book, let's say. We're talking textbooks now. Every single copy of that 10,000 run will be serialized with a unique identifier. And that identifier is scanned, registered, and made legitimate at the printer. It sits typically within some kind of database, depending on how you do it, how you implement the technology. It will sit in a database that allows you to be able to scan that QR code with your smartphone or other connected device, and be able to identify the ISBN, print run, printer, author, title of the product that you produce. It can be an effective tool in being able to identify things, but I've also seen counterfeiters utilize proof tags, where they will counterfeit the tag itself. So you'd have, let's say you have a warehouse of counterfeit books that you have 200 copies of this biochemistry book. All 200 copies of it, if they're counterfeit, could theoretically end up having the same proof tag on it for each of the 200 copies. And therefore, you would end up getting a one legitimate proof tag across 20 or 200 illegitimate copies of the product, therefore making it illegitimate since there's a serialization for each individual copy that's required within that kind of environment. But distributors, say Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whoever, Follett, typically will view those proof tags as a legitimate check mark almost. And they could use it as a crutch in terms of being able to identify legitimate copies that are actually illegitimate in their nature solely because the proof tag itself has been counterfeited. So there's different, it's not a be all end all, I would say.
Interesting. Now there's quite a bit of discussion about Amazon, that most of the counterfeit copies are being sold there. And while they have an infringement portal, they don't really seem to be taking down counterfeit copies that are being reported. Any tips?
Any way to crack the code in Amazon is always difficult. I'll say that. Continual conversation with Amazon is typically needed. I would love to say that they'll change their practices, but their third-party marketplace typically is where the counterfeiters, go to sell their wares. And it is unfortunately difficult in dealing with them in terms of having them adjust and change their practices. Primarily, I would assume because of the amount of money that they're making off of the marketplaces. So while I would love to tell you that you're going to be able to, take down Amazon's third-party marketplace and all of the counterfeit books that are out there or other product. I mean, there's counterfeit other things on Amazon's marketplace, whether it be, cell phone chargers or watches or whatever. It's typically difficult in terms of dealing with Amazon. So I would just suggest continual perseverance on trying to deal with it, and potentially raising up, some kind of potential legal issues if needed within either to Amazon itself, which would be probably fruitless, but more importantly to their marketplaces and proving out to Amazon who's selling illegitimate copies of your product.
Yeah, there was a.
And I was just going to say that Jane Friedman weighed in after that question. You've seen that?
Yeah, I was going to hit Nora's point and then Jane's that commented on Nora's. So
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so Nora is talking about or was asking if there are any tips to get Amazon to actually act on the infringement claims. She's saying sometimes they deny them for inadequate evidence without saying why. Sounds like you've faced the same issue.
Yeah, they've definitely done that. And part of it goes into really getting talking with people on the phone, and actually getting humans involved. There is potential processes regarding inspections within Amazon's warehouses. If you identify a large swath of product that is counterfeit, you would need to work with your Amazon representatives in trying to be able to walk into their warehouse and sort through a third-party marketplace seller's product, or any other kind of legitimate concerns that you have regarding counterfeit products. But that's based off of each individual publisher and Amazon's response to them and things like that. So there's ways. I'm not going to say it's easy. I've sweated through lots of warehouse inspections in the past, but there are definitely ways in which you can work on that.
Jane, to Brian's point, Jane Friedman asked about the David Goggins, or mentioned that the David Goggins lawsuit didn't seem to have an impact. Jane, do you want to say a word or two about that? Because I don't actually know about that lawsuit, and I probably should.
Yes. So give me just a second.
Sorry about that. Sorry to surprise you like that.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to speak. So David Goggins is a best-selling self-publishing author. He sold millions of copies of his book, and he was frustrated by counterfeits being sold in the third-party marketplace for many, many months, and brought it up to Amazon in countless ways with sufficient evidence, I would say. And he finally got angry enough that he did file a lawsuit, but I haven't seen any updates on that lawsuit, and maybe since it was filed, which was in the spring of this year. But the evidence in the lawsuit is damning. And he also revealed that as soon as the lawsuit was filed, all counterfeit sales stopped, showing that Amazon did have the ability to stop this, but chose not to.
Yeah, I mean, they typically have the ability. That's never been the concern. It's a willingness, in my opinion.
There's a note from one of the participants today, Tom Randolph, encouraging folks to email him. He provides his email address in the chat to try to help escalating and taking down third-party seller instances of counterfeiting. So that's at least one resource. And one thing I'd say, Amazon is obviously the largest online retailer, and so a focus, but it's not the only one in which this problem occurs.
Yeah, the problem definitely occurs across multiple retail distribution channels. I would say that eBay is also a place that you can find counterfeits left and right. I saw somebody ask about like invisible UV ink or something along those lines. We've used those kinds of things in the past. I've utilized them. It can be helpful. There's multiple ways in which you can start to provide some kind of identifications within your product. At Macmillan Learning, we utilize the UV ink within our products, and it allowed for easy inspections, I'll say, in terms of being able to determine which is a legitimate copy and which isn't. But just like anything else, a counterfeiter has the ability to be able to reproduce it if they know what they're trying to reproduce. So that goes back to IP protection from the internal side, how you're utilizing your stuff, how you're securing your files, whether you're distributing them freely or not. Those kinds of things start to come into play.
Hey, I'm moving over to digital for just a minute. It seemed like torrent sites were a big issue for a while. Those seem to have faded out a little bit in favor of like Library Genesis and other sites of the sort. Is there anything publishers can do about Library Genesis or those kinds of sites?
I mean, LibGen and ZLibrary and all the other, various, we'll say, portals, for lack of a better term. Takedown notices are obviously an avenue. They aren't necessarily effective due to lack of compliance more than anything else. But litigation's always tough against those kinds of sites simply because they have the ability to pop up anywhere and everywhere. Most of them are also not hosted in the US, so therefore aren't necessarily required to be compliant with US law and litigation. It's always tough. That's sort of the 21st century world that we live in, that files can exist anywhere and everywhere all at once. So it's unfortunate, but there are means in which you can start to tag your files to be able to hopefully secure them a little bit better and help identify any leakage areas. But it really depends on the publisher and what they're willing to spend, willing to invest in those kinds of prevention measures.
Are there any estimates that you know of on the impact of piracy and digital or counterfeiting in the physical world on revenue? So, like, how big a problem is this, say, for different sectors of publishing?
I've seen numbers anywhere between 2 to 8% of revenue, and it really depends on the house. Because if you're a relatively small publishing house that has a couple of really hot sellers, if those works get counterfeited or pirated, they could have an outsized impact on revenue. Whereas if you're one of the larger houses that has a greater breadth of content offerings, if 1 or 2 products, let's say, get counterfeited, it may not have necessarily as large of an impact over total revenue. So it really depends on the house, the content that you're producing, and the attractiveness of that content to counterfeiters. I've seen counterfeiters counterfeit books that were never good sellers for a house to begin with, and I've seen them counterfeit bestsellers. So there's no rhyme or reason regarding what products counterfeiters will produce or digitally pirate. My guess is that they're just once they get their hands on something, they'll produce it. But I haven't seen a tie up. At first, when I first started dealing with this years ago, I had assumed that it was always the bestsellers that were getting counterfeited. That assumption was proven wrong. So there's variations that could occur.
Hey, are there places that you would look to or point people to look for the actual numbers on, like, studies and things like that of, like, what the impact of this is?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you because I don't have anything right off the top of my head. But I do know that stopcounterfeitbooks.com has been a good source for a lot of textbook publishers in terms of just being able to identify textbooks that are counterfeit, what to look for, those kinds of things. But I could probably follow up with some of the studies that I've looked at and provide some links or something along those lines. But I just don't know off the top of my head where some of that is.
Since this is a problem that's shared by pretty much all the members of the publishing community, is there a role or merit for working through trade associations to address the challenge?
Absolutely. The AAP is typically involved in a lot of the lawsuits on a broader level. Making them aware of the problem is always a great thing to do, because at the end of the day, they have the ability to be able to see across the industry what's going on and be able to identify and flag things. I'm not going to say that they'll be the one-stop shop by any stretch of the imagination. Each publisher should be evaluating and identifying counterfeits and piracy as they see fit, but making them aware of those kinds of issues and other trade groups allows for the problem to not get swept under the rug and provides more legitimate concerns regarding the issues.
We did, BISG had an education focus working group on piracy. It goes back to the time before the pandemic, so probably ended in late 2019. And it was trying to look at essentially the supply chain rather than doing an EPEG type thing where we were lobbying. That's not really where we are. But rather just to say, where does piracy occur and in what forms? It kind of devolved into a lot of conversation about the proof tag intercepts, kind of vendor space and demonstrations of those. So not that really useful in the end, but we'd be glad to pick it up again, especially with the supply chain focus, Ken, because that's where I think we can add value.
Now, are there technological solutions for that for digital piracy? I remember that there were companies that you could hire to play whack-a-mole with wherever the things were popping up.
Yeah, so there's various companies that are out there in the universe that you can hire to do web scrapes and be able to send takedown notices in an automated fashion and other kinds of issues that you have the ability to be able to at least push Google, push other web hosts in terms of like taking down advertisements for illegitimate counterfeit copies or digital products. There are companies that will do it for you. They vary. I'm not going to, sponsor any one company here, but they do vary. And there is definitely different approaches that one can take depending on what the concerns are. And those vendors should be able to provide you with a comprehensive overview of what those options are as a publisher, as a client for them.
How about data on ebook piracy versus physical? Anything you see on that?
So it was interesting that ebook piracy remains obviously a concern solely because it's so easily replicated. One of the benefits of physical is that it's harder to do. And when the pandemic first hit, one of the things that we saw was a reduction in physical counterfeits, partly due to, I would imagine, all of the supply chain issues that everybody in the publishing community was dealing with, whether it be port strikes or which are happening now, or the inability to be able to affordably import product from overseas, where most of the counterfeits are created. That by itself, we saw a curtailing of physical counterfeits, although it did not eliminate. Obviously, everything that was already within the country was still sitting in a warehouse. But we did see some curtailing of it, but we also saw the inevitable backlash of it picking up in the last year or so. So there's different trends, but in general, as book sales continue to stay high, there's always the possibility of physical counterfeits implementing in the marketplace.
O'Reilly had a very widely distributed belief that most of the consumers that do piracy of ebooks wouldn't have bought the book in the first place. Do you know if that's ever been confirmed or updated?
There's been some studies on it from O'Reilly and others. I think it really depends on
I did that study.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the product itself that you're talking about. Obviously, within the higher education space, students are compelled to typically buy the product simply because they need it to pass the test, typically. But within the trade space, is somebody downloading a cookbook, let's say, would they actually buy that cookbook? It's harder to tell. But typically, it does vary based off of the marketplace in which you're playing in as a publisher.
Yeah, the work that I did, this actually is perhaps useful for the question that Jason raised about when did this start hitting the radar. So I was doing the research that O'Reilly asked for in 2007, 2008, and I continued it for a couple of years after that. The thing that was really important is I was looking only at O'Reilly titles for the most part. We tried to get other publishers to participate, and there was reluctance at that time. And what we found in general was when books were appeared on, it was much more of a BitTorrent world at that time. Ken was not, and so that you were seeing digital files showing up in online in dark web situations. When those files started to show up, it actually seemed to increase the paid sales, which suggested that what was happening for O'Reilly titles was that people were downloading the torrent files to get a sense of the book, and if it met their needs, they were buying it. And we didn't have a sense of replacement value, like the replacement rate, meaning how many people were not buying it would have. But I also, one of the things we said regularly during that time is everybody should be doing their own study and everybody should be doing it over time, because the situation that existed in 2008 is not the one that exists today. At the time, we were not seeing a lot of invasion of physical formats. Jane Friedman had her own story last year where, she was seeing not just pirated versions of her book, but really counterfeit folks trying to pass themselves off as the ersatz Jane Friedman. That kind of problem has grown significantly, I think, over the last several years.
Julie Blattberg asked a pretty interesting question about intent data, and then perhaps using that to drive consumers to legitimate channels. Julie, this is like a surprise to you too, but maybe you could come off of mute and elaborate a little bit on that.
Hi, everyone. Back when I was at HarperCollins 15 or so years ago, this is something we talked about, and I wonder if there's any publisher or vendor out there who's experimented with it. There's still the question of, would someone downloading a pirated book, would they ever be a legitimate customer? So that question aside, could one use search results and somehow bifurcate the traffic and take away from the people clicking on the pirated content links and instead drive them to legitimate sites? So I'm not sure if I'm articulating the concept, but maybe that will trigger someone's imagination here.
So this would be like buying the keywords for your titles and somehow hijacking, or not hijacking, but ending up with the pointer back to the actual publisher site or to a retailer.
Yeah, something like that. And certainly with AI and programmatic, it could be an easier thing to test at this point.
I mean, BISG was involved when Amazon, which had long allowed book publishers to kind of own the buy button. When Amazon changed its rules and allowed other distributors and retailers to own the buy button if it was cheaper or met other conditions, there was a lot of concern because some of the winners in that sense were not legitimate sellers. Some were, and that wasn't the problem we were trying to go after. But I think, Julie, what you're asking is in part, how do you fundamentally own the buy button, or at least have a chance at convincing somebody to do something right?
Yeah.
So Nora is talking about a special case for education, but I think it could be generalized. She asked if there's any indication that inclusive access programs make counterfeiting less attractive. I'm also thinking, along with inclusive access, is tying it into homework solutions, where it's a services sale as much as it is a content sale. Is that something that is working in education? And are there similar things that could be thought of in trade?
So in the education space, inclusive access is, we'll say, is relatively new. So there's not a lot of, studies done solely based off of whether or not inclusive access is making it less attractive to students to purchase digital pirated copies or counterfeit copies. But I will say that inclusive access makes it less likely that students are going to go out and they would need to opt out of the inclusive access first and foremost, depending on how the inclusive access is set up as an opt-in or an opt-out. And then they would need to therefore go out and find a copy, either physically or digitally, of the product in question. One of the attractivenesses for the education space is that it moves the customer from making all of those kinds of decisions. And it hasn't been around, I think, long enough for us to be able to legitimately say, inclusive access is helping eliminate, counterfeiting and piracy. But I think it is helping to mitigate it in some manner based off of anecdotal evidence that I've seen. And that by itself allows it for students to be able to access legitimate content easily at a relatively affordable price point, and reduces the attractiveness in some manner of having to go out and search for your own copy. So I can't say that it's comprehensively done a huge amount, but I would say based off of anecdotal evidence that I've seen that there's been an impact one way or the other.
There was recently I was at a presentation. I can't remember who mentioned this, but that basically using LLMs and conversational interface as a kind of a co-sale with the book, so that when you bought the book, you could also end up having a conversation with the LLM and others about it. Is anyone getting any traction with something like that, or is that was just like one of those great ideas from a conference that?
In terms of implementation, I don't think anybody's implemented something along those lines at a large scale. There is attractiveness to that, obviously, because if you can sell the ecosystem, you typically don't have to worry about selling the product. But I wouldn't say that there's been any kind of huge headways in that space yet. Doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But I think we're probably still, I'd say, 2 years at the earliest away from it being more widely implemented.
Yeah, I could see that. I remember back when I was at Cengage years ago, we were talking to one of the economists that was publishing, and he was pushing homework solutions. He said, "There's no future in pushing bits down pipes," which unfortunately describes a lot of ebook distribution.
Yeah.
Let me open this up. Takshi, you had an interesting question. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. Do you want to come off mute and ask it about, I think it was microsellers versus the aggregators?
More of a hi, this is Lydia, tax, TACX. It's fine. Whatever you make it your own language. What we notice in our numbers is that, yes, the big aggregators are clearly an issue, and we've heard them, Z Library and Sci-Hub, and you name it. What we also see is quite a large increase in micro piracy, as we call it. So it is individual students, professors, using social media, which is quite often under the radar because we can't get into WhatsApp groups, for instance, where they simply where they use the social media as a marketing platform for free copies. Do you see that as well in other parts? Is that something we only notice?
No, that's definitely been an avenue that we've seen, where people will post on, you know, WhatsApp or, you know, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, utilizing some kind of social media to be able to promote a posted copy of, you know, some book. And those micropiracies definitely exist. I hadn't heard that term, but thank you for putting that in my lexicon. Um, but end of the day, you know, they're harder to deal with in some manner. You have to be a little bit more ginger, I would say, about it than sort of, we'll say, institutional piracy. Solely because, you know, you're talking about individuals now. And while they can be it can be problematic in dealing with them, you know, there can be, we'll say, a PR backlash, depending on how you approach those kinds of things. There are definitely concerns, though, in that space.
Is there a difference in piracy across regions? And are there global strategies or countries that have done a better job than others of addressing it?
There's definitely regionality to it. You know, with I've been focused primarily on in the US, but you know, at the end of the day, some parts of we'll say non-friendly US countries have definitely leveraged that unfriendliness to be able to exploit IP. And that happens across multiple channels. It's not just a publishing issue. But they'll be able to leverage their unfriendliness to the US, and post files for various products or services, you know, to make them freely available to all, whether it be, you know, I'm not going to name any specific countries, but there's definitely bad actors out there from a geopolitical sense.
Have you thought of kind of drifting into a little bit of the AI discussion here? But have you thought about training an LLM on your own content and then making that available for sale somehow or other?
Thought about it, yes. Explored it a little. There's concerns with that too, though. You know, how open or closed is that LLM? Primarily due to the content, the nature of the content that we have in question. You also have to remember that there's, you know, the author agreement side to all of this, and whether or not that allows for those kinds of you know, use cases. And that becomes part of one of the main reasons why you start to see a slowdown in that kind of potential space.
Yeah, very true. Okay, I'm about out of questions. Are there other things that people would like to know about, or if I missed your question in the chat, please feel free to come off mute and either raise your hand or just start talking. And
there was a question early on that you may have missed, was from Stefa talking about uploading pirated content uploaded to YouTube. I would imagine that's an audiobook or something similar. And you know, talks specifically about the takedown request is honored, but then the pirate just creates a new account. Has anyone had experience kind of managing that?
I mean, that happens on whatever platform it is. That's the whack-a-mole nature of digital piracy, more so than anything else. And it takes resolve, and you know, you can be fatigued by it all. But at the end of the day, there's unfortunately, some of these platforms don't necessarily have appropriate, legitimate ways of being able to, or they're not incentivized to be able to identify, you know, repeat infringers as robustly as they theoretically could. in my opinion, at the very least. There are definitely large tech companies that have, I think, dropped the ball on that kind of initiative in various places, whether it be, physical piracy or physical counterfeiting or digital piracy. In both avenues, I've seen reprint infringers on large tech companies, platforms, be able to open up accounts again and again and again. And that goes back to having the appropriate tools or utilizing third-party vendors who have the appropriate tools and can collect data across various industries, various individual companies, so that they can, pinpoint more robustly to that platform that there's a problem across not just Macmillan, but like a whole suite of publishers. That's where having a third party vendor kind of helps in a lot of ways. And they allow for the ability to be able to, send takedown notices and potentially, escalate if needed.
And another observation, and it was a question about the impact of brand registry. It varies by platform, but effectively establishing yourself as the IP owner. Have you found that to be effective, or is that mixed?
It's mixed. I mean, first and foremost, you have to recall that it's only Amazon. So, if you have any other distribution partners, they're not going to recognize brand registry. Or transparency, which is also an Amazon only thing. So there's limitations within that. Granted, Amazon's obviously a large player in the ecosystem, but they're not the only player by any stretch of the imagination. And I would say that the effectiveness is based solely off of the publisher's exposure to Amazon more than anything else. If 90% of your sales is coming from Amazon, it's one thing. If 5% of your sales is coming from Amazon, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, so it's not worth the effort to register yourself if you're on the low end.
Yeah, I mean, nothing bad comes from happening for it, but it would be more limited if you have less exposure to Amazon from a revenue standpoint in terms of revenue protection, which is what IP protection is all about.
Right. There's one more recent question from Jason about companies that might be doing this work to help you combat online piracy, take action on your behalf. I mean, I think Macmillan's probably big enough to be able to take that on itself, but are you aware of companies that would do that kind of work?
Yeah, there's definitely plenty of companies out there. Some are on this call, I believe. I don't want to identify any or endorse any specific ones here, but there are definitely very good companies out there that we've utilized in the past at Macmillan to be able to help combat digital piracy and physical counterfeiting.
Maybe what we can do to help there is put together a short list and include it in the follow-up email where we'll send the recording. That it's not necessarily, we won't present it as complete or recommended, but simply just say, if you want to follow up here, there's one that's mentioned in the chat just now, etc.
Very good. Roger, it's great seeing you. Thank you for the very interesting, alarming and interesting conversation about piracy and counterfeiting. A lot of aspects to this that we wouldn't have known about had we not had this session. Thank you for your time here and for talking to us. And thanks to everyone else for asking all kinds of good questions.
Yeah, thank you all to the moderators as well as all the attendants.
All right. Thanks. You guys take care. We'll have this bundled up and sent out to everybody in the next week or so.